So we're very pleased to have Yaffa Yeshurun with us, Professor Yaffa Yeshurun. Yaffa did her BSc in psychology at the Tel Aviv University and then an MSc in computer science at NYU, where she continued to do her PhD in psychology there. She then joined the University of Haifa, where she is today a professor in the Department of Psychology. Since then, she was a visiting academic at the University of South Wales in Australia, a ZIF fellow in Bielefeld University in Germany. She served on editorial boards of attention and vision-related journals. She published many papers on vision and attention, which is what her research focuses on, including in high-profile journals as Nature, Nature Neuroscience, and others. And today she will tell us about her recent research. So welcome, Yaffa, to our seminar today. We're very pleased to have you.
And thank you, of course, and thank all of you who bothered to attend this talk. Okay, so this talk is going to be about temporal crowding, but I'll start with a very, hopefully I can start. There we go. I'll start with a very brief introduction to spatial crowding so that you'll have the more general context of this work. So, well, spatial crowding is a well-studied phenomena, and I assume many of you know that it refers to the fact that the identification of a peripheral target is harder when it is surrounded by flankers. So as an example, if you fixate this red cross, and your task is to indicate the orientation of the letter T, it's going to be harder for you on the right than on the left, because on the right, the target is accompanied by other stimuli that we usually call flankers. And that's spatial crowding. And there are two more. Okay. But this noise reminded me that I wanted to tell you that you should feel free to interrupt and ask me a question whenever, okay? Okay, so two more things I want to say about spatial crowding. First is that spatial crowding decreases as the target and flanker distance increases. So it should be easier to do the task on the left than on the right because this distance is larger. And also spatial crowding decreases as the target and flanker's similarity decreases. So the task should be easier here than here because here the target and the distractors are not similar. Okay, so now we move to the time domain. And temporal crowding, like a spatial crowding, is defined as the impaired target identification when other stimuli are also present. But since we are now in the time domain, the other stimuli are presented before or after the target at the same location, unlike spatial crowding in which the distractors or the flankers are presented at the same time as the target adjacent location. And this is important. I want to emphasize this, that everything with the temporal crowding that I discussed today, everything is presented at the same location. And that ensures that the impairment that we see is purely temporal, purely in the sense that there are no spatial interaction because everything is presented to the same location. Okay, and then this definition may sound, at least to some of you, very similar to ordinary masking. But ordinary masking, both forward and backward, is over by an SOA of 100 or at most 150 milliseconds. So when the target and the mask are separated by a temporal interval that is longer than 150 milliseconds, we don't see impairment. And there are many studies who have shown that. Whereas temporal crowding refers to performance impairment that goes beyond these limits of ordinary masking. And so throughout this talk, when I say ordinary masking, I mean impairment with SOAs that are shorter than 150 millisecond or at most 150 millisecond. And when I say temporal crowding, I refer to impairment with SOA that are longer than 150 millisecond. And whether or not these two are really separate phenomena that merits the employment of different names, that's one of the questions that we'll ask, and I'll talk about it later. But when we just started this exploration of temporal crowding, the first thing we wanted to know is whether we can actually show an impairment with longer SOAs. Okay. Okay, so when we started, we used these kind of stimuli, but okay, let me just say that when I say we, with regard to this initial project, I mean together with Einat Rashal and Shira that you can see here. Okay, and as I said, we started with these kind of stimuli letters that are rotated. So in a single trial, there was a sequence of 3 letters, all of them presented to the same location, as I said before, a peripheral location, 9 degrees of eccentricity to the right or the left. The target was the letter T, okay? And the task was to indicate its orientation, 1 out of 4, and so our dependent variable was accuracy in this project. The main manipulation is that of SOA, so the interval between the distractor and the target. And you can see, this is an example of just one experiment, but it's typical to all the experiments that we've used in this project. And the SOA, you can see that most of them are longer than 150 millisecond. And we also used a baseline condition in which only the target was present. So that's our uncrowded condition. Okay, and I think that's what I wanted to say here. So here are the prediction that we started with when we just started to explore temporal crowding. We thought, well, if temporal crowding occurs, then we want to see a worse performance when there are 3 letters, and then when there's only a single letter. That's the hallmark of crowding. But also we want to see that performance gets worse as the SOA gets shorter. So we want to see an SOA effect. And that was important for us because we wanted to show something that would be similar to spatial crowding. Because remember that with spatial crowding, performance gets worse when the flankers are closer to the target in space. And so we wanted to show that performance gets worse when the distractors are closer to the target in time, okay? Okay, so here example of 2 experiments in this project. There were several experiments there, but these are just 2 examples. You see here accuracy as a function of SOA. In blue are all the trials with 3 letters. So these are our crowded trials. In purple is the 1-letter trial, so our uncrowded condition. In this experiment, the SOAs, the different SOA conditions were mixed, and in this experiment they were blocked, but it didn't matter much. So the first thing you can see that overall performance accuracy is lower in the blue than the purple, right? When the target was crowded than when it was uncrowded. And this was actually the case also with our longest SOA. You can see this longest SOA is longer than 400 milliseconds. Okay, so these are really long lasting effects. And as we expected, there was a significant effect of SOA. And this effect was significant even if we included only the SOAs that are longer than 150 milliseconds, that are within the range that we called temporal crowding. Okay, so these findings allowed us to conclude that temporal crowding can be found with normal observers with peripheral presentation. Okay. So that was the beginning, and then we ran several experiments with these similar kind of stimuli, and this is all the data, so I won't get into the details of these experiments. I'll just summarize what we found.
Can I ask a question, Yaffa?
Sure, yes, please.
Do you have an explanation for the saturation at long distances? It seems like some kind of a ceiling effect.
If it's a ceiling effect, well, at some point.
I'm just saying that there is saturation. I don't know what's your explanation for that.
It's actually expected, and you get a similar finding with spatial crowding. As the flankers are further away, at some point the flankers no longer affect performance, and you actually call that distance the critical distance. But it's expected that at some point the distractor no longer interfere with the processing of the target. Okay, so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's Michael. I have a question too.
Hi, Michael. Yes.
The SOA you showed, is it the SOA between each element or the SOA of the entire sequence?
The SOA is between the first element to the second, and the same thing between the second. So maybe I'll go back to. So the SOA is the time from here to here, onset to onset. Okay,
So it's
same.
860 for the entire sequence plus the durations, which is more than a second.
Yes.
No, almost a second.
It depends on the SOA, of course, because some of them are shorter, but yes, but with the longer SOA.
Yeah, for the longest one, it's almost a second.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay, sure.
Yaffa, if we're already on questions.
Okay.
Sorry, this is a question.
This is just the initial, but okay, yes, go ahead, please.
The display time has no effect?
I'll talk about the display. You mean the actual target? I'll talk about it, but not in this, not in the initial project, in the next project that I'll get to soon. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Where were we? Okay, so I intended to summarize for you the results that we got when we use these letters, when we use letters as stimuli. So we found that temporal crowding does not interact with spatial crowding. Okay, we found that temporal crowding does not depend on temporal uncertainty, so it occurs also when there is no uncertainty. And we also found that spatial attention reduces temporal crowding, but it does not eliminate it. Okay. Okay. So then in a more recent project, we wanted to start and get some insight regarding the processes that underlie temporal crowding. And by we here, I'm referring to Shira Takach-Dom. And more specifically, we wondered which aspects of perception are actually impaired by temporal crowding. So is the impairment that I've just shown you, does it reflect an actual impaired target encoding, or perhaps only source confusion? And by source confusion, I mean substitution errors. So for me, source confusion means that there was, or the participant were able to generate an intact representation of the target and an intact representation of the distractors, but they were confused about which is which. So they ended up reporting the orientation of a distractor rather than the orientation of the target, okay? And if temporal crowding, the impairment that you've just seen is just about source confusion, this is surprising because it means that we are confused even when the target is separated from the distractor by 400 milliseconds. But I think it's even more surprising if we can show that these impairments reflect at least partially an actual impairment of target encoding, because this would mean that we didn't manage to generate a stable representation of the target, even though we had 400 milliseconds to do so. Okay, so that was one question we asked in this project. Is it this, or just this, or both, or what? Okay, so that was one question. And then the other question, which I actually already kind of mentioned, is whether temporal crowding is a unique phenomenon. By that I mean whether temporal crowding is a different phenomenon than ordinary masking, and also where or how does it stand in relation to spatial crowding. Okay. So to answer these questions, we moved on to use a continuous report task that is sometimes referred to as estimation task, and it gains popularity, I would say. So now the target was not a letter, it looked like that, a circle with a line that has some random orientation, and sometime after the target there was a probe also with a random orientation, and the observers had to rotate the probe to reproduce the target orientation. Okay, and let's say that the participant rotated that much the probe, so then we compare the orientation reported by the participant to that of the target, and this difference between the actual orientation of the target and the one reported by the participant is the orientation error, and we use these orientation errors as our dependent variable. So let's look at a single trial in this experiment. Once again, we have a sequence of 3 stimuli, but now there are not letters, there are these orientation stimuli. Each one of them is presented to 75 milliseconds, and then there's the SOA. Like before, they are all presented to the same location at the periphery, left or right, similar to what you've seen before. Okay, and then the first item and the third item, or the last item in the sequence, are a non-target item, or the distractor, as I keep calling them. And then the second item is the target, okay? And then 500 millisecond after the end of the sequence, there's a probe. Okay, that's the probe, and the task, as I said, is to rotate the probe to reproduce the target orientation. And also, just to remind you, the orientation error is our dependent variable in this project.
If I can
Also-
ask a question,
Yes,
you said that it can appear left or right. So it's randomly can appear all the nine, right or left, in the position randomly.
yes,
So if it's 2FC, the first and the second presentation, it's always in the same location.
always in the same location.
So how you know that the subject, if already it's come to the right, you know that the second presentation will be on the right place. How do you know that you were not looking?
Oh, we measured eye movement, and we measured eye movement, and we just
Okay.
throw trials in which they move their eyes. It's a good question. I neglected to say that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So we manipulated SOA. Okay, like before, the time between the target and the distractor, and you can see that once again all our SOAs are longer than 150 millisecond. And like before, we had an uncrowded condition in which only the target was presented. Okay, so then we took the orientation errors, the distribution of the errors from all the different conditions, and we used the mixture model analysis to analyze these error distribution and to extract 4 different parameters. So I won't get into the detail of the model, it's quite a prevalent model, but I will describe the different parameters that we extracted and what they represent.
אני לא רוצה שתעשי את זה במשקע.
So the first parameter that we extracted from the model is the width of the Gaussian component.
אין צורך.
Okay, the first component was the width of the Gaussian component that was centered around the target, so around zero error. Okay, so basically we got the standard deviation of this Gaussian component, and this parameter gives us the precision of the encoding process. So the smaller the standard deviation, the more precise the target was encoded, or the higher the quality of the target representation. Okay, then the second parameter is the height of the uniform component. This parameter gives us the guessing rate, and it informs us about the signal to noise ratio of the target. But then there's going to be some trials, as I actually mentioned before, there are going to be some trials in which the participant will report the orientation of a distractor rather than the target, or there's going to be some rate of substitution error, and the model can give us that rate too. But as you hopefully remember, we have 2 different distractors. They all have random orientation. I don't know if I said it, but all the different items had random orientation. And so the model, the version of the model that we used here, that was developed by Schechter and Yashar in a very recent paper, allows us to estimate separately the substitution rate for the first distractor, which we'll call beta 1, and the substitution rate for the second distractor, which we'll call beta 2. Okay, and so the basic thing we wanted to do here is to see which one of these parameters is affected by temporal crowding, or more formally, I would say that we wanted to know whether temporal crowding impairs the encoding precision, the signal to noise ratio, the substitution rate, or a combination of these factors. Okay, that was the goal. So here you can see the model fit to the data. You can see the different histogram for the different SOA. So in purple is the actual data that we got, including the uncrowded condition here. And in black is the model, and you can see that the model fit the data well. Okay. And what we'll do now is go over each one of the parameters that I've just mentioned and see whether or not it was affected by temporal crowding. And we start with asking whether temporal crowding impairs the encoding precision. So we start by looking at standard deviation. So this is what you see on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is of course SOA. In blue, like before, is our crowded condition when there was 3 stimuli, and in purple is the uncrowded condition when only the target was present. So you can see that overall standard deviation are larger, so precision is lower in the crowded and uncrowded condition, and this difference was actually significant even if we compare our longest SOA to the uncrowded condition. So our longest SOA here was 475, so we are getting closer to half a second already. And this decrease in standard deviation was also significant. So when we ran ANOVA, we got a main effect of SOA. And this allows us to conclude that temporal crowding degrades the encoding precision. Okay, so we were happy about that. Then we looked at the substitution rate. So now you see here on the left, the substitution rate for the first distractor, of course, as a function of SOA, and the substitution rate for the second distractor. In both cases, you can see that the substitution rate is getting smaller as the SOA gets longer. Okay, and this effect of SOA was significant for both distractors. And so we can conclude that temporal crowding also increases substitution rate in addition to lowering the encoding precision. Another thing that you can see here and is interesting is that we see more substitution errors with the first distractor than the second distractor. And this difference was significant. And I think this is interesting, and I can speculate about it at the end if we'll have time and you will be interested. Okay, so the last thing that is left is to look at the signal to noise ratio. So now I'm plotting guessing rate as a function of SOA. And unlike the other parameters here, we did not find a significant effect of SOA. And so we don't have evidence to conclude that temporal crowding can affect the signal to noise ratio. And this may be not that surprising given the large temporal intervals that we used between the target and the distractor. Okay, so that's the basic pattern of results, and then we wanted to try and explore it a little bit further, so we ran 2 additional experiments. I'll tell you first what we did in these experiments, and then we look at the data of all the experiments together. So in the second experiment, we wanted to examine the effect of stimuli duration, as Gigi has asked before. So the basic design was the same as what you've seen with the first experiment. The only difference is the stimuli duration is considerably shorter. Before it was 75 milliseconds, and now each stimuli is presented for 20 milliseconds, much shorter. The shorter stimuli duration forced us to change slightly the SOAs that we used, but it's not in any meaningful way. All the SOAs are still longer than 150 millisecond, and like before, we have an uncrowded condition. So in all other aspects, it's the same as experiment 1. Okay, so just the effect of duration. And then in the third experiment, we wanted to look at the effect of target distractor similarity, because as you remember, I told you that with spatial crowding, the crowding effect gets smaller when the target and the distractor are dissimilar. And we wanted to know whether we'll find something similar with temporal crowding. In experiment 1, the target and the distractors were very similar. So in experiment 3, we are using distractors that are less similar to the target. So now the distractors are white and the target is black like before. All other aspects are exactly the same as experiment 1. And this is the model fit to the data of the two new experiments, experiment 2, experiment 3. The model fits data well. So let's look at the different parameters. So now to help us compare the different experiments, you see all the data together, all 3 experiments. So in blue is experiment 1. This is the data that you've already seen. In green is experiment 2. So that's when we manipulated the duration. And in red is experiment 3, when we manipulated target distractor similarity. overall, if you just look at it, overall, you can see that actually the pattern of result is very similar for all the three experiments. So indeed, if we start looking at each parameter with the standard deviation, with all three experiments, we are finding a significant effect of SOA on standard deviation. These are the p-value for the two new experiments. So in all three experiments, we find the temporal crowding, the grades, the precision of encoding processes. Also, we replicated the effect of SOA on substitution rate for the first distractor and for the second distractor. These are the p-values. With both of them, it's significant. So we also replicated that. And we also replicated the fact that there are more substitution errors with the first distractor than the second distractor. This is something that repeats in all the different experiments. And finally, we also replicated the lack of an effect of SOA with the guessing rate parameter. And this was actually quite important for us. And it was one of the motivation for experiment 2, because in the first experiment, you might have noticed that guessing rate was rather low. So the lack of effect, of an SOA effect of guessing rate might have been something like a floor effect. So the fact that there was no effect of SOA on guessing rate also in our second experiment, in which the guessing rate was considerably higher, suggests that the lack of effect here was not just a floor effect.
Yaffa, can I ask a question? Hi.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not familiar with this new model, the 2021 version, but there's no dependence between the standard deviation and the beta 1 and beta 2.
The model assumed that the standard deviation is the same for the Gaussian that is centered on the target, which is what you see here. So the same standard deviation is used for the Gaussian that is centered around the first distractor and around the second distractor.
But it should affect, I mean, my tendency to replace by a distractor. The more I replace with a distractor, the larger the standard deviation is going to be, right?
No, the standard deviation, this is the assumption of the model. The standard deviation just reflects how good was the encoding process of the specific item, whether it is the target or the distractor. And it assumes that the standard deviation is the same for all three of them. That might not be a correct assumption, but this is the assumption of the model, and this is the model that we've used. Okay, and then it just give you how often, it just give you a rate of how often you reported the orientation of the distractor instead of the target. But it assumes that the standard deviation is the same.
Okay. I'll have to read into it because it's not, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, while we're there, so there's a very big effect of substitution. 20% and 20% is 40% of the cases. It is substitution and 60% non-substitution.
There is a large effect for the short SOA, there is a large effect of substitution, yes.
Yes, right. And we don't see it on the graph on the preceding slide. The slide, if you go back one slide. Yeah, here we don't see it. I assume because the position is varying or something.
So this is just the error distribution centered around the target, right? Just so zero means zero error, right? But you have to remember that the orientation of the distractor is random, right?
Right, that's what I figured.
But
it would be nice.
You're correct. I did not plot here the model fitting for each of the distractors, but you can do that. I just didn't do it here, but it fits well.
It would be nice to see it just no. It would be just nice to see it in terms of the height of the distractor effect.
Right. I should do that. I will do it. It's a good point, but I did not do it here. Okay.
Thank you.
I have another question.
Sure.
Did you control for the effect of time itself without the distractors? Because with the longer SOAs, there was more time also between the probe and the target. So maybe that also had an effect.
The time if you mean the time between the last item and the
No,
probe,
between the target, actually. Like between the target that you had to then compare to the probe.
So yes, you're right that the time between the target and the probe was longer with longer SOAs. But if anything, you would think that this would make us forget more with longer SOA, and that performance should be worse with longer SOA, which is not what we found.
Yeah, and maybe it even hides the stronger effects that you might find because it would be acting.
So you're saying that maybe the effects here are underestimated.
Yeah, for example, for the standard deviation, like the precision would be impaired by memory. So maybe it actually takes the effect to the other direction. You might actually have a stronger effect.
Perhaps, although you have to remember that they only have to remember here one thing, right? One thing. So it's not that memory is overloaded, but yes, maybe it's possible that these effects are underestimated. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, just one last question. I'm sorry. Can you just mention whether this was within or between block, the SOA manipulation?
Here it's mixed. But
Okay,
we saw from before that you get similar effect when it's mixed and it's blocked, so we were not worried about that.
Right. Yeah, I have a follow-up question, but I think I will reserve it to later. Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, blah, 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 we did that. So you saw that basically the pattern of result is very similar, and so suggesting these are robust finding. And I just want to quickly do the look at the analysis that we did to look just at the effect of duration or just at the effect of target distractor similarity. So first just comparing experiment 1 to 2, so blue to green. We just did an analysis in which the experiment or duration was a between subject variable and SOA was a within subject variable, and the only thing that came out significant was this difference. So the manipulation of stimuli duration, the only thing that it did is that the guessing rate was higher, but it did not interact with SOA. So duration didn't change the pattern of result in any qualitative way, okay? Then we did a similar comparison for experiment 1 and experiment 3, so blue and red. And here we are looking at the effect of target distractor similarity. There was no significant difference in terms of guessing rate or standard deviation. It looks like there should be, but it didn't reach statistical significance, nor there was any interaction here. The only thing that came out significant was with the substitution error for the first and for the second distractor. In both cases, there were less substitution errors when the target and the distractor were dissimilar. It also interacted with SOA, but I think it might be a floor effect here. But anyway, this suggests that the manipulation of target distractor similarity mainly affects substitution rates. Okay, so here I summarize the effect of SOA on all the different parameters that we looked so far with all the different experiments for temporal crowding, and I summarized it here so that I can now start looking at the second question that we asked, whether this is a unique phenomenon, and particularly to compare it to ordinary masking. And I can do so because this previous study used very similar stimuli and a similar analysis to see if SOA can affect the same parameters that I've mentioned. Only in this experiment, because they were interested in ordinary masking, they used SOA that are considerably shorter than what we've used. And this is the pattern of results that they found. So they did not find an effect of SOA on standard deviation and not on substitution rate, only on guessing rate. So you can see that when the SOAs are considerably shorter within the range that I called ordinary masking, the pattern of results, the way the SOA affect these different parameters is practically opposite to what we found with the longer SOA. And this suggests to us that temporal crowding and ordinary masking are indeed different phenomena that are mediated, at least partially, but by different processes. And there's merit and there's a reason it's okay to use different names to refer to these different phenomena. Okay, and then we also wanted to compare temporal crowding to spatial crowding. And again, we could do so because there is a previous study who used similar stimuli and similar analysis to see how these same different parameters are affected. But this is a spatial crowding experiment. So what they manipulated is the distance between the target and the distractor in space, while we manipulated the distance between the target and distractors in time. Okay, so we are focusing now on target distractor spacing, or the distance between the target and distractor. And this is the pattern of results that they found. Once again, practically opposite pattern of result, no effect of distance on standard deviation and substitution rate, only an effect of guessing rate, unlike what we have found. And this also suggests that these two types of crowding, or the impairment that is mediated by these two types of crowding, it reflects different processes. But we also manipulated the target distractor similarity, and this previous study also manipulated target distractor similarity in a very similar way to what we did. We actually relied on them when we did this manipulation. And so we can now compare these two types of crowding with regard to target distractor similarity. So let me just remind you what we found when we compare, remember the blue and the red, we saw an effect of similarity on substitution rate, but not on the other parameters. And this is similar to what they found. They also find that the main effect of target distractor similarity is a reduction in substitution rate. So when we look at similarity, these two types of crowding also show, or do show some commonality. Okay, so let me get to the last project that I want to tell you about today, because this is the most current. This one we actually still collecting data in this project, and this project was done, or it is done together with Tomer Sahar. Oops, I misspelled the name, I apologize here. Okay, so here we are dealing with the question of whether crowding is a peripheral phenomenon. And when we look at the spatial crowding literature, those of you, some of you know it really well, and so you'll know that in most of the literature of spatial crowding, people tend to claim that spatial crowding is a peripheral phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that is unique to the periphery, but we actually know that this is not the case. And there are several studies, and I cite two studies here, but there are several studies showing that it is possible to demonstrate spatial crowding with a foveal presentation when the stimuli are presented to the fovea. And we wondered, what about temporal crowding? Can we also demonstrate temporal crowding with foveal presentation? In all the experiments that I've shown you thus far, all the stimuli were always presented to the periphery. And we did so because a previous study that used foveal presentation did not find temporal crowding with normal observers. But that study was not designed to look at normal observers. Normal observers were just the control for amblyopic observers. So we wondered whether we can actually get or show temporal crowding with foveal presentation if we make the task hard enough. So this is a trial, but before I get into what I do, let me just be honest and mention another motivation for presenting everything in the center, for looking at the fovea. And that's that we were hit by COVID-19 like everybody else, and it became really hard to collect data at the lab. So we wanted to try and collect or run these experiments online. And of course, when you run experiment online, you can no longer prevent eye movement. So peripheral presentation is not a real option. And so we wanted to know whether we can actually get temporal crowding with a foveal presentation. And if so, then we can start running temporal crowding experiments online. Okay, so this is an online experiment that you see here. the basic design is similar to what you've seen before. I'll explain now the differences. First of all the stimuli are presented at the fovea, at the center. And then to make the task harder, we presented the stimuli in noise. So I hope you can see that I tried to simulate the noise that was presented in those experiments. The stimuli duration was kind of in between the two durations that we examined before, but you saw that stimuli duration has no qualitative impact. And then another difference is that because online experiments need to be short, they can be too long. We could not use a large range of SOA, so we only use these two SOA, 200, 400 millisecond, again above 150, and we had an uncrowded condition in which only the target was presented. Okay, so let's start look at the effect of temporal crowding on the different parameters. We'll start like before with the standard deviation. Okay, so again, standard deviation is a function of SOA, uncrowded condition, crowded condition. We found here a significant effect of SOA like before. And also we are replicating here the fact that even with a longer SOA, the standard deviation is significantly larger, or precision is significantly lower with the crowded than the uncrowded condition. So we can conclude that even with foveal presentation, temporal crowding degrades the encoding precision. Okay, what about guessing rate? So here too, we are replicating the fact that there's no significant difference. Those significant effect of SOA, very similar to before. So still no evidence of an effect of temporal crowding on the signal to noise ratio, also not at the fovea. And in terms of substitution rate, we found a significant effect of SOA with the second distractor and a marginal trend with the first distractor. And this may not have reached statistical significance because you can see that at the fovea, the rate of substitution is considerably lower. So that might be some kind of a floor effect, but maybe not. Also at the fovea, temporal crowding increases substitution rate. But you may notice that there is some difference in these results at the fovea from what I've shown you for the periphery, and that's the fact that now the substitution rate is lower for the first distractor than the second distractor, okay? Opposite to what we found before. It was not really significant, but it's interesting that it's now opposite. Okay, so here I summarized the experiment online. Now, because we are really new to this online world, but I recommend you to try it because it's amazing how fast you can collect data there. And also because this was our first attempt to test temporal crowding in the fovea. We wanted to also run a similar experiment in the lab to see if we can replicate those results in the lab, to know that we can trust them, right? We were not confident yet about this online experiment. So we're still collecting. This is an experiment that we're still running because collecting data in the lab is so much slower than collecting data online. And now we in lockdown again. But I'll show you the result that we managed to collect thus far. So that will be in red. Okay, so you can see that the results in the lab are very similar to what we saw online. All the pattern is basically the same, a reduction with standard deviation, substitution rate for the second, not for the first, but very low substitution rate with the first in comparison to the second, and no effect of SOA on the guessing rate. So we seem that we can really trust the online experiment that you just saw. Okay, and then I have a few more minutes, so let me tell you about just one more experiment that we did online with foveal presentation, because there's something interesting there, and then I'll summarize. So we ran another online experiment, which everything is presented in the center as the first online experiment that I just told you. But now, to make the task harder, we did not use noise, but we made the contrast very weak. I can't tell you how weak it is because remember, this is an online experiment. I don't have control over people monitor and so on. I cannot measure luminance, so we could not measure luminance. So, but you can keep in mind that the contrast was low, okay? And these are the results that we got. So I'm showing everything together now, also because I'm short of time. So like before, we are seeing a significant difference between the short and the long SOA and considerably smaller standard deviation for the uncrowded condition. We are seeing a significant difference between the short and long SOA also for substitution with the second distractor, but not with the first distractor, also replicating the fact that there's more substitution error for the second than the first. But the interesting part is that now for the first time, we are finding a significant difference between short SOA and long SOA also for guessing rate. Okay, so it's quite interesting that when the stimuli are particularly weak, that the contrast is very low, then suddenly we are seeing an effect of temporal crowding also on the signal to noise ratio. So that's quite interesting, and we can maybe also discuss this later if you want. Okay, so let me summarize. You've seen that temporal crowding degraded the precision of the encoding processes. It increased substitution rate, but it did not affect signal to noise ratio in almost all of our experiment, apart from the last one. And we got a similar pattern when the target was similar or dissimilar from the distractors, but the pattern was very different when we look at the pattern of results for ordinary masking. And this leads to the conclusion, or the first conclusion, that temporal crowding is not merely very long masking, rather it involves different processes. Okay, you also saw that we got similar pattern of results with foveal presentation and with the peripheral presentation. So we can conclude the second conclusion that temporal crowding is not unique to the periphery. And finally, I want to emphasize that because we found in all the different experiments that I've shown you for the second and third project that temporal crowding degrades the encoding process, it degrades the precision of the encoding process. This suggests that we need quite a long time to generate a stable representation of the target. And this means that the generation of a visual representation, a stable one, okay, is considerably slower than what was thought before. And that's it. So thank you. Thanks my collaborators, and you can ask more questions now.
Thank you, Yaffa, for a wonderful talk. And I want to invite everybody to unmute themselves and give you a big applause. And yes, it's open.
Can I have a few questions, Yaffa?
Of course.
Okay. Basically, what you suggest is that the difference between crowding and masking is depend on the temporal domain or the temporal time presentation. But there is
no, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I agree with what you said, but I'm not sure I understand it. So maybe.
But you suggest that if I perform experiment for short duration, so I can call it as a masking. But if it's long SOA, is supposed to be crowding.
Yes, I'd say we showed that you get very different pattern of results where the SOA is short and long, and I conclude from that, but you may disagree, it's okay, but that different processes are involved. But this is just about temporal crowding, right? I did not say anything about special crowding in that regard.
Exactly. So there is a paper by Stremant and Kavanagh that show that the crowding is depend on the temporal presentation, basically. For short presentation, you get more crowding. Long presentation, you get less crowding.
Here you're talking about special crowding, right?
Yes, but the special crowding is depend on temporal. Mm-hmm. So you cannot distinguish, you cannot disconnect between space and time here. And related to this, we have a paper with Maria, with Levin Pola to on 12:15, and we show that space and time and temporal and spatial crowding and masking are very related. Basically, we show for many different parameters that you basically you measure temporal crowding, even when it's overlapping or in space, it's very related to the masking in fovea and periphery. So basically, what I think is one of the important parameter in crowding, and it depends on eccentricity, presentation time, and so many different parameters. So
okay, I absolutely agree with you. I'll just say that in all of these experiments, there was no special interaction, right? I tried to emphasize this, but maybe I was not clear enough. But we did try, I did not show you that because this is the older data, but we did try to find interaction between spatial and temporal crowding. So the stimuli, so the target, there were at the same time, I mean, at the same experiment, the target was accompanied by flankers that were presented at the same time with the target, only at a different location. And also, like in all the experiment that you've seen here, there was also a distractor before and after, and we manipulated both SOA and target distracted distance in space within the same experiment. And in that experiment, we did not find, we had two different experiments at least. I mean, we piloted a lot, but we could not find an interaction between spatial and temporal crowding. So between the manipulation of SOA and the manipulation of distance. I will say that my intuition tells me that there should be an interaction, okay? But we could not find it. But we did this experiment with the letter stimuli, and I do intend to also try again to find that interaction with these orientation stimuli, that maybe they are more sensitive to show those interactions. So we do intend to try it again, maybe online, now that we know that we can actually, but yeah, I don't know if it'll work with the special crowding at the fovea, because with special crowding, it has to be really short presentation to get it. Well, maybe we can try it. With the online experiment, you could just try because it's so easy, okay? So, but it's definitely on my to-do list to look at the interaction also, because my intuition tells me that there has to be interaction. We were very, very surprised.
okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Very nice presentation, very interesting results. I have a very principled question. Why do you find this temporal crowding at all if there is no ordinary masking? What makes the difference? Why is ordinary masking over after 150 milliseconds?
I think
and you find these long effects?
I think it just depends on how hard the task is. So I think people did not find, because usually, I mean, I think the task was not hard enough. I really don't know. First of all, a lot of the masking experiment were at the fovea, but we are also finding it at the fovea. So, I mean, maybe they were just not interested in those longer SOA, so they didn't even try to show it. Try to show it in the sense that they did not design the experiment or the parameters of the stimuli duration, the stimuli contrast, to be optimal for showing effects with longer SOA. That's the only thing I can say. But you see that this is quite robust. It's not that.
Oh yeah. I'm not doubting the results at all. I was just wondering why.
I think that people were not interested that much in this longer SOA, because we all think that vision is very fast. That's how we are educated, right? And we don't even 400 milliseconds. Of course, there's not going to be interaction. So people don't. So when you design your experiment and you maybe pilot a little bit at the beginning to see how, what contrast, and you don't try to use the optimal parameters for longer SOA. You just use them for shorter SOA, and then with those parameters, you don't find interference with long SOA. But if you have the longer SOA in mind, then you have different parameters, and then you find, although we also used a very short presentation, like duration, like, yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Yaffa.
Sure.
I have a question, but I
Yeah.
think Josh also wanted to ask, and maybe he should ask first. It's probably the same question. Go ahead, Josh.
Thank you, Shaul. I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to get a word in, so I typed a couple of questions in the chat. Let me ask you, Yaffa, the easier one first.
Okay.
So your conclusions about the precision of encoding, they're drawn from error distributions where you
From this, I'm sorry, the error distribution. Yes.
distributions, right?
Uh-huh.
So there are two types of errors, right? There are random errors, which will increase the variability of your error distribution. But there are also constant errors that are produced by things like the tilt after effect and so forth. And it seems to me that if you pool across trials with randomized flankers, that those constant errors will actually masquerade as random errors, inflating your estimate for precision loss. Is that a cause for concern?
Do you think that we should get tilt after effect even with the 20 millisecond presentation?
Well, you know, you could just look.
We can just look. I didn't look because I didn't think you can get after effect. And also these and remember that the target is also the second item. So it's always, so the third item is also functioning as a kind of a masking, although not with the long SOA. Yes.
But just the thing, Yaffa, note that constant errors can be assimilative as well as repulsive. You just might want to look.
Okay, I'll take a look. Okay.
Shall I ask my second question?
Of course.
Thanks, Uri. Sorry, Shaul. So isn't it possible that some of the response errors might be due neither to encoding nor substitution, but decoding? You know, perhaps the target is encoded with perfect precision. It's just that what the observers wind up doing is giving you a response that's based on the average or some other statistic.
So for the average, this is actually something Shaul asked me some time ago. And we actually looked at that. So we tried to see if the model fits the data better if we also throw in the average, but that was not the case. So it doesn't seem to be the case that they're reporting the average.
Okay, perfect.
So that was your question.
Yeah,
Yes.
Okay, so you see, I listened to your question before, and we actually went on and tested it. So
Very good. Okay, good.
Yeah, it was a good question.
Because it has been shown that with spatial crowding, the subjects do know the average.
Right.
It's not that the middle one disappears. It's included in the average.
They might know the average. Actually, on part of this long to-do list, one option is to actually ask them to tell the average. I mean, right now, of course, they might know the average, but we don't ask them to report the average. So one of the things on the to-do list is to actually ask them to report the average and see how well they do.
Yeah, but we all know about contraction to the mean, so you would expect them to go towards that when trying to estimate any one. But okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I'd be happy to ask a question about the blocked versus the within design. So basically, it seems to me that this suggests the temporal crowding is unaffected by temporal expectation or temporal attention.
Right.
So you could imagine that if it's blocked, I should be expecting the target at the same time and building expectation toward it.
Right.
So I'm just wondering what are your thoughts about it, and if it is not affected by temporal attention, is there some way to explain how this process is excluded from temporal attention in some way?
Okay, so I agree with you that it means that I'd say the temporal crowding does not reflect temporal expectation, because whether they knew when the target is going to appear or not, they performed, we still saw, these are two different experiments, but we still saw that, so we cannot, it's not like we try to see the effect of temporal expectation on temporal crowding. But we just saw that temporal crowding is still there, even if they know when the target is about to appear or when they don't know. So our goal, maybe I was not clear, our goal was to show that temporal crowding is not, because we started with a mixed design. So we wanted to show just that temporal crowding is not just an outcome of the mixed design, that it's not just because they don't know when the target is about to appear. So for us, it was important to show that you also get it when they know when the target is about to appear, but we did not directly test the effect of temporal attention. This is something that is also actually on our to-do list. Might be actually the thing that we'll try next. So, okay, so to summarize this, I can tell you that the temporal crowding does not depend on temporal uncertainty, but it might affect it, okay? If we do it within the same experiment, we might see that knowing when the target is about to appear results in smaller crowding or something like that. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yaffa, I'd also like to ask if you think that the effects of the first and second distractors or maskers in time, are they additive? I mean, if you would do an experiment where you only have the first, where you would have, let's say, a temporal masker that is before the target, and another experiment which would be just after the target, would you see that, would you see the same effects, or do you think it would be a linear summation, your experiment now, of these results, or do you think people are going to be, I mean, are going to be doing much better when there's only one kind of masker? I'm just
right. I really cannot not answer this, because in all the experiments we tried, there were always two distractors.
Yeah.
So I really don't, but my guess is that it really going to depend which distractor, and I think that the second distractor is more critical than the first one, okay? And I think that because in the first project where we used letters as stimuli, in that project, on some of the experiment, the target could appear either in the first, so it was a sequence of three, either first or second or third, okay? And when the target was the last item in the sequence, we did not find temporal crowding. So performance there we only looked at accuracy, and accuracy did not change as a function of SOA. It wasn't necessarily better, actually. On some of these experiments, when the target was third, it was not better than when the target was first. Overall accuracy was not better, but we did not find the SOA effect. So I think after the succeeding distractor is critical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
But I have to try.
Hi, Yaffa.
Hi.
It's Owen. I have a question.
Sure.
You said, or maybe it's a guess, I don't know, about you said that there is a difference between the crowding in the fovea and the periphery, and the fact that in the periphery, the first distractor was the main effect, and in the fovea, the second distractor, right?
Right.
So I think it could it be related to, if it's in the periphery, you can just ignore the second distractor after you see the target. But if it's in the fovea, it's harder to ignore because your attention, your spatial attention is directed to the center, like something like that.
I'm interested because we had we started to speculate about that, and we don't, I mean, by we I mean me and Tomer, we don't quite agree on why this is the case, why we are finding this flip in terms of which distractor generates more substitution errors. But we do think that it might be related to attention also, okay? I mean, one
Yes, I
thing-
think like maybe it's spatial attention because
Yeah,
also,
special attention. Yes, yes, special attention, because when it's in the periphery, you don't know before you see the first distractor, you don't know where it's going to appear. Whereas when it's in the fovea, you know that everything is going to be in the fovea, and so you already pay attention to the distractor, the first distractor, because you pay attention to the fovea, everything's going to be in the fovea. When it's in the periphery, you don't know where the first item will appear. So only when it appears, you can move your attention there. So now where me and Tomer don't agree is what this means in terms of how much attention you pay to the first distractor, and whether this help you, whether this end up in more or less a substitution error. So we think it's related to attention, but as I said, it's completely speculation at this. I think that the distractor that you've seen, that you coded better, is gonna interfere actually less, because then you know that you, well, I don't know, maybe I should not speculate because I'm not sure. I think if you know that the distractor is a distractor, then you don't report it, right? You even if you don't know what the target is, but you know that, say, the last one was a distractor, you are going to report something that is not the orientation that you've seen. So you're going to guess, or maybe you report the first or the other distractor that you are not sure about, but you're not going to report the distractor you're sure is a distractor, something like that. But it's complex. So we are, and I'm definitely interested if people have some ideas of why we get this flip, and when we compare the fovea to the periphery, then I'm interested.
Yes, thank you.
I want to follow up on Oren's question and ask, so the distractors you used were from the same class of stimuli as the targets. Letters with letters, orientation, like a clock. So what happens if you just use something that is completely neutral, let's say some noise mask, white noise or Gaussian noise, or anything like that, or just checkerboards, which will clearly mask the visual input with the icon, but will not interfere with the same class of visual representation. So do you think clearly the model that you're using will not be appropriate because you don't have confusion with these maskers, which will not be, people are not going to be confusing the targets with these masks, but do you think it will influence the performance, make it better?
Yes, the answer is yes. But of course I didn't try it. Actually, in terms of the model, it's not a big problem. You just don't include the component, which is from the side
components.
Right. But as we actually do in the uncrowded condition, right? Because there are no distractors.
Exactly.
But so in terms of the model, that's not a problem. But I think that if the distractors are going to be completely different than the target, they might not be temporal crowding. Just as with special crowding, when the distractors are very different from the target, you either don't get crowding or very little crowding. We did, as you saw, just a little bit changing, a little bit making them dissimilar, did not eliminate, not even reduced in terms of standard deviation, at least not significantly. It did reduce, but not significantly. But I think that if they'll be very, very, my guess, we'll have to try it, but my guess that it will matter.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Yaffa. So thank you very much for this wonderful talk, and again, very.
And thank you very much, and for all the interesting questions.
Thank you. And I want to say that next week we'll be having Bruno. Always hard for me to pronounce this. Rizwan here. He will give a talk in a regular hour, and I welcome everybody to join us. We will publish the title of his talk soon, so I'll send you all a message about that. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Bye.